It's wonderful to welcome Dr. Mark Bradford to the show. He is the Fellow for Persons with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities at Word on Fire Institute. Mark, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks. I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. And
Good.
in this dialogue of ours, we'll be focusing on Catholic ethics and persons with disabilities. So first, I'd like you to tell us your journey as a Catholic.
Sure. First of all, let me make one correction to something you said. I'm not Dr. Bradford. I don't have a doctoral degree.
Okay,
So
so
just
check
so
mark.
that's clear. I'm often accused of that, but it doesn't but it doesn't apply. So I wasn't born into a Catholic family. I was I was born into a fundamentalist faith called the Church of Christ, which is mainly a phenomenon in the southern part of the United States. I'm from California, and there's a large presence of the Church of Christ in California too. So I became a Catholic in 1987, and that's a long story in itself. But uh, ever since then, I became a Catholic, went to graduate school, moved from California and the West Coast of the United States to the East Coast of Princeton, New Jersey, and went to graduate school by way of a monastery in Massachusetts called St. Benedict Abbey in Still River, Massachusetts, where I was able to really spend some time in correspondence with people in my family and friends who were objecting to my conversion to the Catholic faith, but also a time to really be in the company of a wonderful community of men and to have a lot of time to think and to pray and to really decide what my future course would be from there. So I had already applied for graduate school. So I went on down to Princeton, New Jersey to graduate school and then met my wife and we started our family and we've been in the Philadelphia area ever since then, with the exceptions of a brief 4 years or so in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on the other side of the state of Pennsylvania where we are. So that's sort of in my pathway to really a life since, well, 1990, probably, of working in the church in various ministries. So I was blessed to be hired to teach at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. I have a background in sacred music. So I was hired there as a director of sacred music, and I taught some other courses too in the humanities and taught homiletics also there for a while. And then from there went on to head a small Catholic school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then worked at the National Catholic Bioethics Center for several years. And then from there, I had an opportunity to begin a U.S. branch, I guess you could say, of the Jerome Lejeune Foundation. Jerome Lejeune was the French geneticist, now Venerable Jerome Lejeune was the French geneticist that discovered that Down syndrome was caused by an extra copy of the 21st chromosome. So in 2012, I left the National Catholic Bioethics Center to work on that project with them and did that for a few years and have eventually found my way here to where I am now for the last 2 years, working with the Word on Fire Institute as their first fellow for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities, where I'm able to concentrate very specifically and completely all of my energies and efforts into working to try to accomplish two things that are a part of the fellowship. One is to defend the church's position with regard to the threat that prenatal diagnosis poses to those who are able to be prenatally diagnosed with intellectual or some sort of genetic anomaly. And then the other is to work within the church to try to find a place of greater acceptance for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities through providing resources, opportunities, writing and publishing, speaking, doing things like this, having conversations with you and others around the need to really accomplish what Jesus so clearly told us to do right from the beginning, right? Whatsoever you do to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you do it for me. So that's the task.
That's
That's the
wonderful.
task.
Yes. And there are a lot of topics there that you've brought up that can be addressed throughout the conversation. But I'd like to follow up with what drew you into the Catholic Church?
Yes. Um, well, Dante had his Beatrice. So seems like there's always a woman involved. So I was living in Santa Barbara. I was working and teaching in a public school in Santa Barbara. And one summer I did a musical theater show called Brigadoon and saw again a woman that I had known when we were young children named Denise. And she was also in the production and we got to know one another. And again, it's a long story, but I'll abbreviate because there are lots to talk about. Over the course of our relationship, as it grew more serious, we both realized that I was a member of the Church of Christ. She was a Catholic, and there was no place where we could build a future together. And while I was born into the Church of Christ, and all of my family had been deeply involved in the Church of Christ for as far back as anyone knew, was something that I always struggled with because it just seemed like it was, we had like 70 people in our congregation, the Church of Christ in Santa Barbara, California. And I thought, okay, so God sent his son, Jesus Christ, to come and into this world and to show us a pathway to salvation, to suffer and die for all 70 people sitting here in this little church in Santa Barbara, California. There has to be something wrong with that story. And some other things that they said that just didn't make sense to me. So eventually, our relationship, Denise's and my relationship, fell apart over this difference of religious faith. And I realized that I really didn't believe what I had been raised to believe. So I left that church the same day that we broke off our relationship, which really began this pathway of trying to sort out what I believed and what I didn't believe. And at that point, I wasn't really sure that I believed anything. I just saw religion as a source of division and nothing more than that, really. That breakup happened on a Wednesday, and on Sunday, I had always been in church on Sunday someplace, and unless I was sick, I just was always there. And I realized for the first time in my life, I had no place to go, and I didn't know really if I wanted to go anywhere or what I believed. But I thought, well, I had been to a midnight mass with Denise the year before at Christmas at a Poor Clare monastery in Santa Barbara, which is very close to the Santa Barbara Mission. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just go to this mass at 7 o'clock on Sunday morning and sit there and just I have someplace to be. So I did that and then took off on a walk out around the grounds afterward, around the mission and the seminary there, and just had one of those cathartic moments where everything crashing down on me, and I realized that I was just adrift with nothing, literally nothing, because I had already told my family that I was leaving the Church of Christ, broken off the relationship with Denise, and I was there on my own with no faith, no relationships, no family in a sense, because while they had disowned me at that point, everyone was very unhappy with what had happened in my life. So that began a process that lasted from July of that year, 1987, until I was accepted into the Catholic Church, baptized conditionally because I wasn't sure about my first baptism in the Church of Christ, confirmed and received my first Holy Communion on November 1st, 1987, at Thomas Aquinas College in Santa Barbara, California, where I had met a priest who was giving me instruction and helping me along. So again, lots of details in there that I won't go into at this point because there's too much to talk about. But that was sort of the pathway. You know, it was initially Denise, but I knew as I came to understand more through those months that I was not going to become a Catholic to restore a relationship with Denise because I realized it was too important of a decision. But I was just hit flat in the face with the reality and the beauty of the Roman Catholic Church, the church Jesus established. And from the beginning, had been the repository of his truth through the words of Holy Scripture and the tradition that was preserved in the church as well. And I just was faced with its beauty, just its overwhelming beauty, and I just collapsed under the reality of that, the weight of it. But at the same time, it's a weight that just allowed the freedom to, the freedom to just embrace the history and the glory and the love of God and the art and the music, everything that is ours to share in this beautiful faith.
Yes, of course. That's an incredible story. And since we're recording, the day before Ash Wednesday and we're entering Lent, so
Yeah,
I hope you have a blessed Lent, and I hope that faith that guide you will be renewed and replenished.
thank you. Yeah, and you the same. All of us need that every day, right? It's beautiful to have this season where we can intensify that quest.
Yes, much appreciated. Um, yeah, so you mentioned Jerome Lejeune, the
Yeah.
Venerable Jerome Lejeune. How would you assess him as a Catholic role model?
Yeah. Well, the church, before they will declare someone venerable, has to prove through an inquiry that they possess heroic virtue. Not just virtue, not just the ordinary virtues that most Christians are called to possess, but those virtues to an heroic degree. So Jerome Lejeune, I never knew him, but I knew his wife and his children through my association with the Jerome Lejeune Foundation and many trips to Paris, where I would spend time with him and get to know them and come to hear more and more about him. And also Aude Degas, who is the postulator for Jerome Lejeune's cause, is a good friend of mine. So I got to know her more as well. And the more I came to know Jerome Lejeune through a little book that one of his daughters, Clara, wrote called Life is a Blessing. And then through my conversations with Aude and the investigations that were taking place then initially, preparing to complete the diocesan phase for his process of canonization, I just learned more and more what he sacrificed for for these children. It was 1958, I believe, when the paper was published that gave evidence that the 21st chromosome, an extra copy of the 21st chromosome, was responsible for the syndrome that had traditionally been associated to John Langdon Down as having identified this suite of symptoms that recognize someone as having Down syndrome, as it came to be called. When he realized that, and the more he continued with that, in the United States, our Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973, and that was our law that enshrined the right to abortion in our federal constitution, just overturned in, I think was it 2022? I think it was, with the Dobbs decision of the Supreme Court. But they had a similar battle going on in France over life and over whether or not abortion would be legally sanctioned. So Jerome Lejeune realized when he had made his discovery, almost at the same time that amniocentesis was used for the first time to identify a genetic anomaly through an evaluation or analysis of the amniotic fluid, you realize that he had opened the pathway for the prenatal discovery of children with an extra 21st chromosome Down syndrome that would lead to their abortion. And as a faithful Catholic, he committed his life to what he hoped would be a cure so that there would be so the reason that one might use to abort a child with Down syndrome would no longer exist because there would be a way to what he said cure that child in utero, which was never realized in his lifetime, is still not realized today. But nonetheless, he fought horrible battles over that. He was a When he made his discovery and published on his discovery, he was immediately vaulted to international acclaim because he had solved a riddle that had been there forever. And he launched this whole field of cytogenetics, where you could analyze the genome to discover the cause of disease. So he became sort of like a celebrity on the genetic circuit. He received the Kennedy Prize from President John F. Kennedy in 1962 in Washington, D.C. He received, I think in 1973, the William Allen Memorial Award, which is the highest award that a geneticist can receive by his professional association. So he was a celebrity, he was a star. And when he went to receive the award, the William Allen Memorial Award in San Francisco, I believe it was 1973. I could have the date wrong, but I think it was. He contemplated what he would say in his acceptance for that award, and he went up onto the dais to receive his award and made his speech. And in that speech, in a room full of geneticists, he challenged them about how they would use the information that they now had and what that would mean for life. Would we use it to cure or would we use it to kill? And he said that, made this statement, a famous statement there. He said, the National Institutes for Health, or a governmental agency in the United States that oversees healthcare, essentially, should be renamed the National Institutes for Death because of their acceptance of abortion and their willingness to use this information that this field of genetics have been able to discover to rather than cure people, to kill them. And he strongly objected to that. And at the end of his acceptance, and this again, big event, it says he's in the company of his peers, he left the stage in silence and everyone turned away from him. And his fame, the requests for him to speak at professional meetings and associations dwindled down to practically nothing. He began to lose his funding for his research in Paris and essentially was willing to sacrifice whatever he had achieved to work on trying to save the lives of innocent human beings in the womb. Heroic virtue. So there's that, and also, Chung, his attitude toward people that disagreed with him. He fought many battles, in the media and in public debates. But he would always tell his children, it's not the person that we're fighting against, it's the ideas that those people hold that we're fighting against. So we have to keep that separation. We have to value the human person while we disagree with those things that they're advocating for. So again, heroic virtue in the face of persecution and threats to his life in some cases. He was willing to stand firm and not condemn the individual, but realize that it was false beliefs that the individuals held that were condemning themselves. So so in terms of his process now, the church in investigating the documentation that Ode wrote is the postulator, what we call a positio, that's submitted to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. It was determined that he did in fact hold heroic virtue, for these reasons and many others as well. And so the church declared him a venerable. Pope Francis declared him a venerable. I think it was in 2001. Not sure, but I think 2001. So now we continue to pray for evidence of sanctity and a miracle to be reported and validated and move him to the next level of a blessed.
Yes, I shall keep him in my prayers. So the idea that Dr. Lejeune was fighting for, does it still persist in the United States healthcare system today?
It is very much present, yes. It's very much present in our healthcare system here in the United States and really across the Western world. It's a huge problem. There's a researcher who's a geneticist and runs the Down syndrome program at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. And he does a lot of sociological research, as well as research into sleep apnea and other things that affect individuals with Down syndrome. And they recently published sort of a retrospective study of how prenatal diagnosis is delivered to families and how and what the doctor's attitudes toward pregnancy with a fetal anomaly. We'll use the technical language, a fetal anomaly for Down syndrome might be. And this is a retrospective study to see if there had been any progress made over the last 20 or 25 years. In the United States, we've had this series of laws passed in various states that have required in law, 23 states in the United States of our 50 states have required in law that physicians provide fair, balanced, accurate, up-to-date information about Down syndrome in particular to families who receive a prenatal diagnosis. Not only abort this child and try again, but these are the potential outcomes, positive as well as the challenges that might arise in terms of health and raising a child with Down syndrome. Nothing has changed. In fact, the way that prenatal diagnoses are delivered is as poor as it's ever been, and there are still medical professionals who some of them will just schedule an abortion for a patient because they assume that that's what they're wanting to do because their encouragement for abortion is so high. So yes, and in some earlier research that Brian did as well with his team, they evaluate every so often the impact that prenatal diagnosis has on Down syndrome. And they've discovered that since what was the year? Maybe it was in the 1980s or 1990s, something like that. The Down syndrome population is 30% less than it would be if there was no prenatal diagnosis and abortion in the United States. So that, we're it seems that about around 67, which was an earlier statistic of 70% of babies that are prenatally diagnosed with Down syndrome are being aborted in the United States. And those numbers are higher in other countries. Spain, Italy, two traditionally Catholic countries have even higher numbers than we do. So yes, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. And now, we have more and more use of in vitro fertilization, IVF, and which of course means that they're screening out any sort of embryos that they might be able to detect with an extra chromosome or any sort of genetic anomaly. And IVF is an evil in itself in the church's view. I certainly believe as well. Um, but it's even being used for a eugenic purpose because it's providing families the opportunity to accept a child with a disability that they will refuse. And so the embryos are just destroyed. So we're destroying embryos through the process of in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And we're destroying fetuses in the womb that are prenatally diagnosed with Down syndrome, trisomy 18, trisomy 13, Klinefelter syndrome, and a host of other genetically identifiable anomalies. So we're working on screening them out and being pretty successful at that.
That's wonderful. But when I hear about these instances, as well as your neighbor up north, Canada, and the increasing popularity of euthanasia as a medical option, I
Yes.
thought to myself, well, I'm not a doctor, but aren't doctors supposed to save lives instead of, doing the opposite of that?
Yes, and that was one of the famous quotes of Jerome Lejeune is to hate the disease and love the patient. And what we're doing is we're just out of this feigned love, I suppose you could say, for the individual, although one might question the motives ultimately. We're just encouraging people to die, providing opportunities for them to do so. I think in 10 states in the United States now, it may be 10 or 11. Kind of lost track of the number, but we offer physician-assisted suicide. Not euthanasia, not the direct killing of a person, but providing the means for a person to kill themselves. But you're right, in countries like Canada and the Netherlands, it's a huge problem. There was just a study done by a university in England, Kingston University, I think, that reviewed some of the data from the Netherlands, from deaths in the Netherlands that had been granted through their program, their euthanasia program. And a number of them were of individuals who had autism and intellectual disabilities. And the justification that the committees gave that reviewed the cases and approved their death was that their conditions were incurable. When those people were reporting that they were in more of an existential crisis. It wasn't, their disabilities, whether it be autism and intellectual disability, wasn't terminal. But what they saw as terminal was their loneliness because they had no community. They were alone. They didn't have anyone to support them. They had a difficult time dealing with the inconveniences of their life because they had no support to do that. And yet, the committee that evaluated their request to die said that their condition was incurable. So you're saying that we can't provide any community to you. You might as well just die because you're just going to be lonely anyway. So rather than providing the antidote to what was troubling them and wanted them to die, they just killed them. They killed them. So yes, in Canada, they're broadening, as we know. What did I see? A statistic not long ago. Was it 1 in 20 deaths in Canada was attributed to their medical assistance in dying program, something like that. It's a huge percentage of the deaths. And I've heard from physicians in Canada that they don't even account for them all because often the death that's a result of their medical assistance in dying program, and this is anecdotal from physicians up there, take it or leave it, that often the reason or the cause of death that's listed on the death certificate isn't the MAID program. It's the condition, whatever it was that they had, whatever illness it was that they had. And now they're looking to expand the MAID option to individuals who are homeless, who are drug addicted, or in these other circumstances of life. So, once we step on that slippery slope, and that's what's happening, as we know, in the UK. That's the debate that's going on in the UK now, right? I just saw, and in the UK, people were polled, citizens in the UK were polled, England and Wales, I think it was, were polled, and 80 some percent of them believe that they should be able to kill themselves if they get to a point in life where they no longer want to live. And I just read recently in news that that same statistic was paralleled in South Korea. South Koreans were polled on the euthanasia question, and I think it was 80% in South Korea as well that were favorable to having the option to kill themselves at some point in life. So we have a huge societal problem here, and it's my opinion, it's the devaluation of life that began with the legality of abortion to begin with, where life just becomes something that we can control at our whim because we no longer see God as the author of life. We never see our lives in the hands of God, who gave us life and is the only one who has the right to take it when our life here is complete.
It's staggering to know that.
Yeah, it is.
Since you mentioned, the E word, eugenics, I think this is the time for us to say that all Americans really should check out the Supreme Court case of Buck versus Bell. I believe it was decided in 1927. Um,
Right.
it is related to eugenics, where a woman, of course, her last name being Buck, I believe it was Carrie Buck,
Harry,
was
yes.
ordered by the court to be sterilized because she was believed to be mentally disabled, or as the court put it, mentally feebled or something like that. And I believe
Imbecile. Yeah.
I believe it was Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. who said that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, and that's just staggering. And I believe there's this lone dissenter, and he was a Catholic. I think it was Harlan or some other justice.
Pierce Butler. Yeah.
Oh, Pierce Butler. Okay, good to know. Thank you. So I wonder if the idea of eugenics which was like hugely popular in early 20th century America, as well as the undergirding idea of social Darwinism, does it still have a foothold in American society today?
I think it has a very prominent foothold in American society today. We're just afraid to call it that. But yeah, the Buck versus Bell decision resulted in the sterilizations of thousands of individuals across the United States as other states began to take up the Virginia statute and bring them in. And Hitler's eugenics program even relied on, what was the scientist's name that was involved in that? It was a Cold Spring lab up in, I don't remember his name offhand, but anyway, the Nazi eugenics program was even sort of styled after the sterilization laws that were passed in this country as well. So it had a tremendous impact then, as you said, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, all these notable families were supportive of eugenics. So what do we have now? Well, we talked about it a little bit already. We have the problem rather of prenatal diagnosis that is expanding and growing as the technological ability expands and grows and becomes less and less expensive. We can sequence the genome now. We can do partial sequencing, and we can do, you know, um, forget the term, that's the medical term for it, but we can take a sample of fetal cells, and we can run them through a screening process and compare them against a typical, so-called typical cell, and identify the genetic markers that might lead us to understand that that person has some sort of potential even for disease, and not just sort of genetic anomaly, which is easier to find. we have something called non-invasive prenatal screening tests where they take a sample of a mother's blood, and in that sample of a mother's blood, they can find placental DNA from the fetus circulating there, identify that, and give a probability that that woman will give birth to a child with Down syndrome or some other disability. So, and then we have in the United States now this pronatalist movement, which is focused on they understand that we're in a population crisis because Americans have been having very few children. That's a crisis in the West generally, and also some countries in Asia, as I understand. So we have a population crisis, and they're realizing that we have to repopulate the earth, or we're going to do ourselves out of existence. So they're encouraging people to have larger numbers of children, and some of them are having larger numbers of children, but they don't want just typical children that God provides. They want children that are like super children. So uh, some of them are using IVF only to engender their children so that they can screen those embryos before they will implant the embryos and give birth to the child. You know, Elon Musk, who's very prominent in the news in the United States now as a pronatalist, he's got what now 13 children from however many different women. And so he believes we have to repopulate the earth, but he also wants to have the best and the brightest as well, obviously. So, and then we learned that the United States, that the President Donald Trump has come out in support of IVF recently, which has inherent within it, uh, uh, you know, a eugenicist motive or at least subtext, and that people who go through IVF will certainly screen the embryos that are engendered in that process and will only select the best and the healthiest ones to implant. So everything that we have going on here now, from the increase in prenatal diagnosis and our continuing understanding of the genome, we're even coming to understand more and more that there are genetic markers for autism. And I wonder how long it will be until those are able to be prenatally diagnosed as well, and people will begin to eliminate children that are prenatally diagnosed with autism. I think is within the realm of possibility and probably not too far off. So we have eugenics is creating a super race essentially, right? So there's a negative eugenics and there's a positive eugenics. Negative eugenics is the situation with Carrie Buck. No, we're going to sterilize someone that we label as an imbecile, even though there was very little evidence that really shows that she was. Her mother, they claimed, was, and then she had already had a child, and they didn't want any more of that going on. So that's the three generations of imbeciles that Oliver Wendell Holmes mentioned. So we can go way back to that sort of negative eugenics where we get rid of people, we don't allow people to reproduce who we believe will perpetuate flaws in humanity. And then we have a sort of a positive approach to eugenics, which is a breeding. So when you're breeding crops, you know, we want to be able to spray cornfields with Roundup so that we can kill out the weeds, but we don't want to kill the corn. So we genetically engineer corn that you can spray with Roundup and it won't kill it like it does all the other grasses in the field. So that's a positive eugenics. So what a pronatalist will do who wants a super race of human persons is that they will go through IVF and they'll screen out the defective embryos and try to give birth to the healthiest ones that exhibit the greatest traits for success and good health. So yeah, eugenics is alive and well in the United States and beyond.
Yes, I suppose I'd like to mention the an example that comes to us from Australia in the form of Princeton professor Peter Singer. I'm sure you're
Yeah.
quite familiar with him. His most controversial idea yet is that he believes that babies that are born with terminal illnesses or severe disabilities should be euthanized as a form of mercy. And I think that in itself, it's worth spinning your head over. And so I wonder, what can Catholic teaching be, how can it be utilized to rebut this line of thinking?
Well, I think Catholic teaching is not complicated in this regard. There was a beautiful document that came out just last year in 2024 from what we now call the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, called Dignitas Infinita. And it was the product of a process that began back in 2019, where they realized that there were anthropological issues becoming more and more prominent, questioning who we are as human persons and questioning this whole concept of human dignity. And so they began then to work on a document that was only finally produced 5 years later in 2024 that discussed the topic of human dignity. And it reinforced the belief that the church has held from the beginning, that we as human persons, created in the imago Dei, in God's image, and redeemed through the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, have an infinite, this use echo John Paul II in talking about an infinite dignity, but we have an inherent dignity that exists just because of our creation as human persons. But someone like Peter Singer will question what a human person is and say that, well, a human person is only becomes a person once they're able to, well, and then you develop this whole sliding scale of what once they're able to, well, once they're able to what, once they're able to be outside the womb and breathe on their own, once they obtain a level of sentience where they're able to think in some visible sort of way, or at what point along a sliding scale to someone actually become a person. And Peter Singer would put that bar pretty low. The church says there is no sliding scale of humanity, that we are born with an infinite, again, to quote this document, that's a controversial word, I understand, because we understand that only God has an infinite dignity, but we share in that dignity through our adoption as sons and daughters of Christ, obviously, and again through our creation in God's image. So for the church, there's no sliding scale. For the church, we all possess this inherent human dignity. We've also always talked in the past about a dignity that can be attributed to someone, or how different ways that our dignity can be compromised. And another thing that this document, Dignitas Infinita, did was take this concept of an attributed dignity and divide it into categories that help us understand a bit better the challenges that we can face. And one is moral dignity, and we can compromise our moral dignity through sin, right? We can live a sinful lifestyle. The prevalence of pornography in our culture, for example, mainly moral sins could cause us to compromise our dignity. Never take away our dignity as a human person, but to compromise how we live to realize that dignity through a life of grace and a life with Christ. Another is a social dignity, and its circumstances may be brought on by extreme poverty or unemployment, or situations where we might see people are homeless, whatever it is, that in society's eyes, we see somehow those people as less because they don't rise to the level of a standard in society, maybe by no fault of their own. And then the third one that it mentioned is an existential dignity. And we talk about an existential crisis, people who are trapped in addiction, people who are trapped in horrible situations of war, famine, whatever it may be. All these things that can bring an existential crisis to the person. So dignity can be compromised in that sort of way as well. I just submitted a piece just yesterday for publication at Evangelization and Culture Online, and talks about what the pro-life movement needs to do now in the wake of the Dobbs decision, where abortions since 2000 to 2023, after Dobbs anyway, had increased 11% in the United States. Two-thirds of the abortions now in the United States are chemically induced abortions, mifepristone, the abortion pill. Many of those are probably not recorded in that 11% statistic to show the increase of abortions even after the Dobbs decision. Most of the states, and I don't remember now the number of states that have put abortion on the ballot, but life is only one in 3 of those states, and death is one in at least 10 or 11 of them. So we see where the culture stands. We see that the winds of culture are foul. They're blowing in favor of death and destruction. I mentioned earlier the 80% statistic out of the UK, the 80% statistic in South Korea. So in their 1978 document on persons with disabilities, was a pastoral statement on persons with disabilities that the US bishops published in 1978. They said that we need to expand what we understand being pro-life to be. And we need to expand it to include not just abortion, and now we would add euthanasia to that, which wasn't a situation in 1978, but we need to include things like homelessness, access to health care, education, all these things that are components of what Catholic social teaching calls integral human development. So we need to take the whole concept of integral human development, which is concern for all those who share our common humanity, that they don't live in situations of social compromise of their social or their existential dignity, but we raise them out of those situations. We create a culture where abortion truly does become rare and a regrettable choice, and not one that, in the case of disability, a woman or a family believes that they have to make because they can't adequately care for the child. They can't love the child as they think they should. The child won't have a right to access to education or whatever the circumstances might be. So I think the church, just like Jesus said it should do, needs to live the gospel of life in a way that provides for all lives. Am I my brother's keeper? Yeah, we are. We're called to care for one another, our brothers and sisters, within the body of Christ or not. We need to care for all of humanity. That transformed the world just after the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, when the Holy Spirit came and ignited this movement that spread throughout the known world and changed the culture from a culture of death to a culture of life. And it was that way. Acts, the second chapter, 42nd verse or so. What did the disciples do? They sold all that they had and had all things in common. They cared for one another. They lived as a true community of faith. I'm not promoting a socialist economic system here in saying that that's a gospel value. It's which pope was it that said, if you once you've provided for all of your basic needs, everything else you have belongs to the poor. We need to start living like that, myself included. I say these things all the time and I write these things all the time, and I just condemn myself every time I do it because none of us do it adequately.
And going back to um, the prenatal diagnosis, the topic, I wonder how much power or leeway does the parents, the expecting parents, have? Like, can they say that, we know that there are these genetic anomalies, but we wish to have this child anyways and raise it and love it
Sure,
the way God intended?
sure. What's being reported often now, because we're finding trisomy 18 and trisomy 13 were always considered to be a death sentence when that diagnosis was given. A child with trisomy 18, especially, might be born and live just a few short hours. But there are cases of children with trisomy 18 living much longer than that. So what you point out, Chung, is becoming a real issue now, and that's that oftentimes when a prenatal diagnosis of what a physician would consider to be a life-limiting or a fetal diagnosis, the medical care changes, and no longer are you offered. You have to fight for what you're able to do. You have to fight for prenatal care. You have to fight for the provisions being made at delivery to care for the needs of that child, and any further diagnostic procedures that might need to be done to know. Because a physician will just assume, diagnosed at trisomy 18, nothing we can do. We're not going to waste our medical resources on this child. Parents have to fight for that. So we still have the right to do that. There's I think, it was Denmark that claimed that they were going to be Down syndrome free by whatever the year was. I don't remember. And so what that creates in a society where there's no requirement to have prenatal diagnosis and then to abort after that, but a social pressure is created on a family because they realize that no one else is going to have children with Down syndrome. And so what is my child with Down syndrome going to do when the child has no peers and no resources? So there's a there's a difference in approach. There's an approach that says, okay, sort of a totalitarian approach, which doesn't exist at least here and in many countries of the West that I know of, where prenatal diagnosis automatically will terminate the life of that child. Don't have a choice. I don't think that exists. Certainly not here, and I don't even know if it does in some of the more, you know, atheistic countries that exist in the world. Maybe it does. I don't know. But you can also create a society where there's a social pressure to terminate the life of a child. Um, and that is the area that I'm talking about when I'm talking about focusing on integral human development. And that's the reason for the laws that were passed in these 23 states that are not being followed, where physicians are supposed to give information that provides a balanced perspective to a family rather than just offer an abortion and get on with life.
So, how can we imitate our Lord Jesus Christ in the treatment of persons with disabilities, physical or intellectual?
We have to love them and we have to care for them. Um, Again, it's a lot of conversation about around what disability really is and how we define it. You know, there was something called the medical model of disability that was more prominent a few years back, where once a prenatal diagnosis was given or a child was prenatally diagnosed or born with a disability, it would become a medical concern. And the disability community objected to that and moved something called a social model of disability now that believes that what really should happen is that society needs to change to accommodate the individuals who have problems of access or any sort of impairments that might prohibit them from fully participating in society, so that we no longer see them as disabled. We see them as just differently abled, which is a fairly common term these days, and remove the social barriers to inclusion. Someplace between those two is the reality, I think. I was just saying to someone yesterday, actually, that uh, advocates in every area that we have advocacy for, it seems, are um, very vocal in what their demands may be. But the ones who are very vocal are the ones that are capable of being vocal, or the ones who are families of people who have disabilities. The people who don't have the ability to voice their own advocacy are the ones that we need to be concerned about and care for. So, what does the church need to do? We need to care for all these people. We need to create places of welcome in our. I'm going to see if I can get rid of that blur because it's blurring everything. It looks like. I know. Do I look blurry? On my end, it looks kind of blurry. I don't know why. So we need to work. We need to work from small to large. You know, the only person ultimately I can control is myself, and then I can work with my family, and my family can come together and agree on these things and how we treat our son with Down syndrome, for example. Then we can work within our parishes and create places of welcome and opportunity within our parishes to include people, embrace them, love them as our brothers and sisters in Christ. And then it just grows out from there, becomes an example for the world. We show the world by our love for everyone that everyone matters. And I think we've seen, as we said earlier, we've seen that happen before with us transformed culture. And I think if we would all get on the same page and quit arguing over what definitions of disability are and how evil the charity model of disability is, because no one wants to feel like they're a charity case. Well, Christ actually asked us to be charitable to one another. 1 Corinthians 13 is a beautiful reading we all appreciate. So sorry for the blur. I don't know what this must be on my camera. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. We can still hear you. Okay, so um, yeah. So I like to talk more about your son named Thomas, I believe. Yes, Thomas
Hmm.
happened to be my confirmation name when I was confirmed into the church.
Yeah,
Amen.
mine too. How about that?
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Um, so the Word on Fire bio says that, yeah, describes your son as gifted, as in being gifted, well, additionally with an extra 21st chromosome. And I think that that's something that I prefer to think, when you think of the word disabled, you think of someone being lacking in something that they should have, but being gifted is, having more of something that other people may not have as much. So yeah. So tell us, to what extent are people with disabilities are gifted, and to what extent should we, you know, learn from their gifts?
Yeah. First of all, disability is a huge spectrum, so it's difficult to generalize. I can talk about my son, and I can speak from St. Paul, who mentions that everyone in the body of Christ has a role to play as a member of the body. So therefore, there are gifts always someplace. We just have to realize them. And I think we're obligated to help everyone identify their gifts and to bring them to service of the body. Excuse me, my son, Thomas, is just he's for the most part a joyful young 23-year-old man. He has no judgment. No, he loves everyone. Um, Everyone in our community loves him. He is simple. We're all called to be simple. And for him, being simple isn't hard. It's within his nature to be simple. He brings joy to our home. From time to time, he brings frustration to our home too. And then that's a gift to me and to his family because we have to accept him for who he is and recognize the limitations that he has and accept him for who he is without judgment. So we have to appreciate within every human person who God created that person to be. And if God created an individual to have an extra 21st chromosome, that's what God created that person to be. If he created a person to have cerebral palsy, we love and accept that person for who they are, and we look for the gifts that that person can bring. And often the gifts that that person can bring is just what Thomas brings when we go to Mass on Sunday, or he goes to brings joy. It's like a ministry of presence that brings joy into people's lives. Sometimes people's impairments are gifts to us because they call us out of ourselves and they help us understand the weaknesses we have within ourselves that God is challenging us to overcome. That's a gift. That's a gift. It's the sand that makes the pearl and the oyster. And we have to, so many parables in the New Testament that talk about, the thinking of the parable of the banquet in Luke, the great banquet where the master of the house prepares a great feast and he wants to invite everyone in, and the servant goes out and invites people, and everyone has an excuse why they can't come. So he invites the people in who are poor, poor, and under that, all kinds of things come under poor, includes vulnerable, disabled, all sorts of categories can come under the idea of poverty in the spiritual sense. Or you think of the rich man and Lazarus, which is a real compelling one for me because it's so direct in what it's clearly telling us we need to do. We can't step over people in our streets who are poor. We have to care for them and do what we can for them. We can't ignore people that walk into our parishes and are different than us because they make us uncomfortable. Uh, the Good Samaritan, got all the people who passed right by And it was the Samaritan that came down and cared for the person. All throughout the Old Testament, even it doesn't even have to go that far. You know what were the Israelites commanded to do in the Exodus? And once they were established in the Promised Land, don't glean your crops, save a certain percentage of your crops for the poor. Um, so that admonition to care for the poor comes to us from the very beginning of our history as a people, and it's a lesson still in 2025. We most of us, and again, pointing my finger this way, most of us are unwilling to accept and embrace. And the gift in poverty is the challenge that it provides for those of us who are not poor, or at least consider ourselves to not be poor, to come out of ourselves in service to others, which is what Jesus wants us to do clearly, plainly, but it's just so hard for us.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Just to mention, I'm 25 years old, so Thomas is close to my age.
How about that? Great. He would love you.
No, I'll be very much flattered. I hope to meet him at some point. Well, I wish you and Thomas and the family a blessed, joyful Lent and happy Easter. And thank you very much, Mark Bradford, for joining the show.
A pleasure. Thank you. God bless you.
And to you.